Hello everyone. It is Monday morning, March 23rd, kind of the start of our first full week in Georgia, not officially under a quarantine or not officially under social isolation, but kind of adhering to the protocols that have been kind of laid down by or set forth by the CDC and a whole lot of other organizations. Had decent response thus far to my first two videos on the mystical marriage and the spiritual life according to St. Maximus the Confessor. And so over the next few days, I plan on releasing a video a day or something around that. And we're going to just sit here and read stuff from St. Maximus the Confessor's spiritual life and reflections from Elder Emilianos. So that is there. One thing about this book, and I'm going to leave the description link to the Amazon video or to the Amazon page for this book in the description below. It's a beautiful book. One of the things that came with it was a bookmark, nothing of major import, but the reason I share that is because it shares a prayer before reading a holy book. And I'm going to read that, and then we're going to get back into the material. So this is prayers before reading holy books. O Lord Jesus Christ, open the eyes of my heart that I may hear your word and understand and do your will, for I am a sojourner upon the earth. Do not hide your commandments from me, but open my eyes that I may perceive the wonders of your law. Speak to me the hidden and secret things of your wisdom. I have set my hope on you, my God, that you enlighten my mind and understanding with the light of your knowledge, not only to cherish those things which are written, but to do them, that in reading the lives and the sayings of the saints I may not sin, but that they may serve for my restoration, my enlightenment, and my sanctification for the salvation of my souls, and salvation of my soul, and inheritance of life everlasting. For you are in the enlightenment of those who lie in darkness, and from you comes every good gift, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So the original prayer, the original chapter, I always want to call Maximus's chapters on love prayers, as I probably already mentioned that. I mean, it's just something that kind of naturally comes out. Today we'll actually kind of get into the second of the chapters on love, but I want to remind you of where we were to begin with, and that is this. He who genuinely loves God prays entirely without distraction, and he who prays entirely without distraction loves God genuinely. But he whose mind is fixed on any worldly thing does not pray without distraction, and consequently does not love God. If you're joining me for the start of this video, I explained kind of why, in the last video that I did, I explained kind of why that's not as bad as it sounds, but it does sound very bad. And we talked about kind of genuine love for God and the way we understand, yes, no, love God, don't love God, saved, not saved, just to put it very simplistically in terms we understand, is not kind of what Maximus is talking about. And so when he talked about genuinely loving God, it talks about that comes from the verb to be. The adverb genuinely comes from the verb to be, which means to come into being or to be born. And so you're constantly, as Paul said, you're constantly renewing your mind for that activity. And that impulsive self-will, anything that divides or fragments you from God, is a sign that one, you don't love God and that you've never truthfully, genuinely loved him. It's not saying that in a moment you haven't experienced that. So it goes on to talk about the difference between those who, the last video was again about he who prays entirely without distraction loves God genuinely, and then he whose mind is fixed on any worldly thing does not pray without distraction. I'm going to read the last section of that phrase, I'm going to read the last section of that chapter and then move into the second chapter on love, because there's flow and there's connection. To what does the mind incline? To things that belong to the mind and to which the mind has been joined. In other words, the mind inclines to things that conform to its way of thinking, to its wishes, and to its desires. One thing I'll add right there is the psychologist Carl Jung, said that this is in Psychological Types, chapter 6, types in poetry, I believe, and Jung talked about the psyche creating reality every day, and it's a mental engagement that creates reality. So again, I'm going to read that. To what does the mind incline? To things that belong to the mind and to which the mind has been joined. In other words, the mind inclines to things that conform to its way of thinking, to its wishes, and to its desires. Desires will be important in a minute. What I desire, what seems good to me, what I wish for, something I think I have to do because if I don't, the world will fall apart, as people say, constitutes the turning of my mind away from God and prevents me from praying without distractions. Instead, the mind must be completely empty. All things must be removed from it. Everything must be submerged in the abyss of ignorance and oblivion so that the mind can reach upward and be seized by God. One of the things that I'm working on in this, and I'm terrible at it, is just being quiet and sitting in complete reflection, removing everything. You know, it sounds very much like a meditative practice, and that's kind of what it is. Removing the mental images from your mind is ultimately kind of what this first section is asking you to do, and hopefully in that you can pray without distraction. The second chapter on love reads as this, but it's a continuation over the last chapter. The mind that dallies with a sensory object clearly has some passion for it, such as desire, sorrow, anger, or resentment. Unless it despises the object, it cannot be freed from the passion. Okay? So again, the mind, it has a tendency to be joined to or inclines itself to conform to the ways of its thinking, its wishes, and its desires. So the mind that dallies with a sensory object clearly has some passion for it, such as desire or anger or sorrow or resentment. We'll go through each of those individually. Unless it despises the mind, unless it despises the object, it cannot be freed from the passion. So here in this section, what we're going to read today, we're going to go through each of the desire, sorrow, anger, and resentment. And so what Maximus and then the elder is going to do, Elder Emilianos is going to connect the sensory attachment to the passion. And those passions, again, are desire, sorrow, anger, and resentment. And we'll go through each one of them and kind of what each one of them means, which will kind of take up the rest. And then tomorrow we'll talk about how to despise those and move those objects, those sensory objects, and move from them. So again, the mind that dallies with a sensory object clearly has some passion for it, such as desire or sorrow or anger or resentment. Unless it despises the object, it cannot be freed from the passion. These words are a mirror in which we can see the depths of our soul. When the mind wanders away from somewhere, this is hardly a chance or random occurrence. It is not simply the result of a stray thought or distraction, or as if it was something fleeting that belonged to the passing present moment. To the contrary, it reveals that there is something deeply rooted within me that I must find and uncover. For example, when I pray, I notice that my mind has wandered off somewhere. When this happens, I can struggle to bring my mind back to the words I was saying to God. This, however, does not mean I have achieved any kind of definitive victory. It is rather a momentary activity, a reaction to what took place in that particular moment. What is certain, however, and is of the essence here, is that if my mind wanders off somewhere to something, especially if it lingers there and constantly returns there, it means I have a passion for that thing, and I must discover what it is. If I cannot discover it, my mind and my thoughts will return to it unceasingly. You come to me and ask. This is more in the monastic tradition. Remember, this book was written for, or this speech was given to monks on Mount Athos, but it's applicable. So adjust the elder's question, or adjust the elder's story to fit your circumstance here. You come to me and ask, Elder, why do we do this or that in our monastery when all the fathers of the church say we should do exactly the opposite? I explain the reason to you, and you say, yes, I see you're right, but a month goes by and the same question arises in your mind. Once again, you come to me, and once again, I explain the reason, and once again, you understand the reason, and you say, forgive me. It was my ego that drove me to ask that question. When a particular desire continually arises within us, by which I mean a particular chain of reasoning or line of thinking, when the same thing continues to stir up, or when we run to the same problem with people, or when something takes place that we do not like or approve of, what happens? We return yet again to the same thing that we've already discussed 15 or 20 times, or more like 15 or 20 years. This means that we are in the grip of some kind of passion. Another example. You find yourself thinking or holding opinions that are contrary to those that prevail in the monastery, or that differ from what the abbot says, and you ask, what is God's will for me in this particular situation? The matter is clarified, and you come to a resolution. After a while, however, you ask yourself again, what does God really want me to do in this situation? Insofar as they're asking me to do doesn't make any sense. Should I simply be obedient and do it? Or has God sent me here to speak the truth? Once again, you've returned to your same old dilemma. The recurrence of this dilemma has nothing to do with truth. It has nothing to do with love for the monastery, and it has nothing to do with humility. But it has everything to do with the particular passion that is at work within you. And this can be a way of thinking, a desire, a bit of egotism, relative to whatever it is you are always returning to and mulling over in your thoughts. So the connection between the base desires that you're having is not the search for truth, it's the search for ego. And I know Father Constas and the confessor would both relate that back to partaking from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and doing that kind of in its improper form, taking it in an embodied manner, right? You're wanting to know something, but you're wanting to know it for yourself. That's an embodied way of encountering that. When you observe your mind returns to some sensory physical thing, okay? When your mind is coming back to the same sensory thing, and this is something that will unfold over time here, and I hope on this channel, is that for Maximus, or anybody who I would kind of put falling under some of Maximus's teachings, one of the things that you need to know is for Maximus, there was both the sensory realm, which is how we, that's the place where everything about our senses is interacting with the world. But then the confessor also thought that there was an intelligible realm, and something that kind of rules over the sensory realm. And there's a lot of that in a book called The Ecclesiastical Mystagogy, which I think we'll do next, or I plan on doing next if we're still quarantining. So anyway, when you observe that your mind returns to some sensory or physical thing, or some kind of thought or image, either because you're attracted to it, or because you have some relation or attachment to it, or because it is some kind of power source for you, or fills you with a sense of vitality, so you become preoccupied with it, when you can be sure that some kind of passion is concealed within you. Saint Maximus mentions a few passions, such as desire, sorrow, anger, or resentment. Let us consider each one of these in turn. So I'm going to return really quickly to when you observe that your mind returns to some sensory or physical thing, or some kind of thought or image, either because you're attracted to it or because you have some sort of relation or attachment to it or because it has some sort of power source or it fills you with a sense of vitality, then you can be sure that some kind of passion is concealed within you. And, for me, that can be just being a good teacher, right? That is a desire for me. Being a good coach is a desire for me. And what we're about to get into is that, and desire is one of these main words that we're about to talk about, that it's not necessarily that it's good or bad, but desire is about binding yourself to something and attaching yourself to something else. And remember that Maximus the confessor, considers all of these chapters as he describes relationship to God. He views all of these in the context of a nuptial union. So anytime your mind attaches itself to some sort of sensory object, according to the confessor, it is your mind kind of putting something in between. It's an affair with God. You're cheating on God. Anyway, and the desire part of this is pretty rough. Everything else makes pretty sense. When you get into sorrow and anger and resentment, those will make sense, and there's a lot there. But we're going to start with desire, which is an interesting section. So, desire. When is desire a passion, and when does it become a passion? Does this happen when it is an evil desire? No. Every desire, by definition, is a passion, because when desire is active within us, we cannot pray without distractions. And this, as we said, means that instead of love for God, we have adultery, which we commit with the object of our desire. I desire means I turn my spirit, my perception, my feelings towards something. This something has power over me. It is like something that lives within me. It has a powerful hold over the way my thoughts incline. It stirs up in the depths of my soul. It binds me closely to itself so that I may become one with it. This deep bond, deeply habituated inclination, constitutes the reality par excellence of the fallen ego in human persons. Desire, then, is the means by which I bind myself intensely to something as if I had bound myself to it through marriage in such a way that now I cannot get by without it. And this desire can be of any kind, good or evil. And that little section is one of the shorter sections we'll read. There's a lot more to say about sorrow. There's a lot to say about anger and resentment. But desire is just quick. It's quick and easy, and it's the means by which you bind yourself intensely to something. This is important in brain neuroscience. I haven't talked about this much, but one of the things that I enjoy studying is a type of neuroscience called affective neuroscience. And just a brief kind of thing about that. This is done by a neuroscientist by the name of Jaak Panksepp, who passed away a few years ago. And Panksepp talked about 7 emotional systems that are found in all mammalian species, and they share these subcortical systems. Panksepp is the person who found out that rats laugh and that rats, play, and he found the play circuit in mammals, in mammalian brain function. So a very serious scientist, but he talks about the seeking function of mammals being the strongest emotional, instinctual manifestation. And again, this is more what most people would consider subconscious. But your cognitive awareness is going to impact what it is that you're searching for. And I think that relates back to these desires in the way that the elder kind of presents it. Desire then is the means by which I bind myself intensely to something as if I had bound myself through marriage in a way that now I cannot get by without it. And so when people say, I desire, this turning your spirit towards something, it gives that thing, it gives that sensory object, it gives it power over you. I would say when you do that, when you want something or when you feel that way for another human being, you are objectifying that human being. You're making them, when you want your desires to them, you're making them a specific object. So it doesn't have to be good or bad, right? It's just that your attachment to that keeps you separated from God. All right, so sorrow is next. Here's where we're going to kind of get a kind of a turning of the tide from a desire, which is, it could be good or bad, to kind of a second stage, which is sorrow, and then that leads to anger. Well, that's what we'll cover next. Anyway, sorrow refers to what we usually describe as being dispirited or embittered, as when we say, "You filled my heart with bitterness." To be dispirited means that my wishes were not fulfilled, to be dispirited means that my wishes were not fulfilled, or that something failed to arouse strong feelings within me or left me unsatisfied. I experience sorrow when something I think or believe fails to come about. When things do not meet my expectations, when I cannot satisfy my own desires, or because you have obliged me against my will to do something I did not want to do. To give you an example, it is like when you tell me, "Stop what you're doing and go over there and do that instead." Immediately I am dispirited. I feel sad or disappointed because the change does not correspond to my wishes, and it is at variance with what I think is best right now for me. I think, why are you taking me away from what I want to do? I enjoy the particular work I do in the monastery, but do not want to do the work you want me to do. It doesn't interest me, and I don't want to do it. Sorrow, then, is when something that stems from restrictions or constraints are placed on my ego. But in reality, it has nothing to do with what others may say to do or to me, but rather with what I have inside of myself. What I think or feel, what I believe, and what I want, especially when you do what I want, or you deny what I want, or take it away from me. Seen from this point of view, sorrow is the experience of being closed off within myself. It is the complete, egotistical, stubborn state of self-incarceration within the confines of my individual being. A complete isolation of myself from the other. Sorrow is one of the mortal sins because isolation within the ego means isolation from God and neighbor, which would be, you remember when Christ was asked about the commandments, and he summarized the commandments. He took the 10 and made it 2, which is very Christ of Christ. He took the 10 commandments and he said, "Love God and love your neighbor." And so sorrow, when you are sorrowful, when you again experience of being closed off within yourself, what you want, and you can kind of see where the desire part has moved now. The desire within you that you had has kind of shifted to where you're not getting what you want. I'm going to go back again to affective neuroscience. So of those 7 systems, those 7 affective systems that all mammals have, seeking, they're all, you don't think of them necessarily as ranked, because they're all happening. They're kind of analog systems. They're always turned on. What kind of happens is your mind moves in one direction based on those 7 systems. And so as the seeking system, which is you could consider it the most powerful, it's at least what you want to be in charge somewhat. When the seeking system is not getting what it wants, the response is fear or rage, are kind of the same thing. And you can think of this very fundamentally. It's kind of the fight, flight, or freeze response. And fight or flight is used mostly, but the correct interpretation is fight, flight, or freeze. And all of those are potentialities. And just the circumstance will give you, or give whatever mammal specifically in these instances, the behavior that comes out. You can think about this at a vending machine. So you want, and again, this is a very cognitive expression, but again, it's very interesting because when you're seeking, like you say you're at a vending machine and you want the candy bar or you want the drink, but the drink gets stuck. It's funny, the natural response is to beat the machine or to shake the machine, and that is an affective response. Something within you, you're not thinking, hey, let me beat the crap out of this machine, but something just kind of grabs you and you shake it. Very simplistic representation, but you can kind of see how that goes. So again, you're not getting what you want, and so the response is to close yourself off. That something happens to you, and you kind of go in that. Anyway, sorrow is one of the mortal sins because it causes isolation within the ego, which means isolation from God and neighbor. Yet my neighbor is a member of the body of Christ. His presence to me is the presence of God. Sorrow, on the other hand, is separation from God. And when such separation becomes chronic, it becomes a definitive separation from God. If I'm continuously sorrowful in this way, I am living my life as if God does not exist. Do you see then how desire and sorrow are related? Desire, on the one hand, means that my spirit has become attached to something. My emotional energy, we might say, or the inclination of my will, my soul, has gotten stuck somewhere. Sorrow, on the other hand, is caused by the denial or loss of what I feel, or what I believe, or what I want. We're moving on to anger now. Anger. Pay particular attention so that you can understand what is meant by anger and how everything begins from the ego and how our passions separate us from God and from our fellow human beings. Anger means wrath or irascibility and refers to the spirit of aggression, which of course brings us back to what we said about sorrow. Anger means outrage, indignation, as well as impulse for revenge and self-vindication. The noun anger comes from the verb to have an appetite for, which means I extend or incline myself to or toward something. Just so anybody who's watching this knows, one of my favorite Bible stories, especially from the Old Testament, is Cain and Abel. And essentially, Cain's name is something like to have desire for, and it's an appetite for. He's a consumer. Which again, if you know anything, Cain eventually invents cities, and because he invents cities as a consumer, that requires those types of interactions. Anyway, that's a way of looking at it. It's something that's interesting to think about. But anger means to incline myself towards something. That's what to be angry is. I place myself, as it were, here or there. The idea of extending oneself in this way has a primary sense of being against someone or towards something in order to make it mine, to define my relationship to it in a particular way. Against someone means that I also make him my own in a certain way, since I isolate myself from my neighbor and I make him my enemy. Towards something or someone means that I throw myself forcefully at the other whom I seek to overwhelm and eliminate. It means I mark someone as the object of my anger and hostility and await the moment when I can strike at him. Anger, then, is the desire to wound the other, to mark the other for injury. When we say he's angry at someone, we mean he has marked him, made him a target, and is waiting for the moment when he can strike him with his arrow. It is as if he would like to throw all of his weight against his perceived enemy in order to release his impassioned anger and rage. In essence, to be angry at someone means that we are all disposed towards that person, that we all have a will to dislike and to be hostile towards that person. To have such a disposition to bear this kind of hostility towards someone reveals the presence of a passion within us, and indeed a desire or longing to destroy someone, or a desire to conquer or triumph over someone, making him my own. Although we can say that desire is an internal turn or inclination towards something that I think or believe, sorrow is the internal resistance or opposition to something that others impose on me, which contradicts my ego. Anger, finally, is the external manifestation of my sorrow, my resistance directed towards the person whom I identify as the cause. So that was anger. Last one is resentment, and we'll finish up for the day with a reflection, or not a reflection, but just one summary sentence, which we'll pick up with tomorrow, and that will lead us through a long reading to finish up this kind of first chapter. So this is resentment. The notion of resentment has a deeper, more inward meaning. It is not simply my assault, as it were, on the other, but it means that I take the negative thing, which I believe you have done to me, again, think about Cain and Abel, and internalize it within myself. I keep it under lock and key, and I await an opportunity to unleash my anger and attack you. I hold on to a negative thing. At the right time, which is always the wrong time, I strike. The resentful person is the one who has permanently established within himself an opposition towards someone else, who has made a permanent his commitment to act on his feelings of hostility, to act on what he thinks or believes, or whatever it is that he thinks will give him a feeling of completeness and satisfaction. Resentment is the definitive turning away from the other. This is why the resentful person is not able to experience love, happiness, or compassion. Such a person thinks that no one loves him, that everyone is out to get him, conspires against him, talks about him behind his back. He made that remark about me. He was actually talking about me when he said that. He must know something that he's not saying. The resentful person spends his life imprisoned behind 1,000 walls. No matter how many of these walls he might demolish, he will never be able to communicate with his brother unless the merciful God comes to his aid and knocks down all walls. Up until this point, the meaning of the confessor's teaching is this, okay? And so this is a summary of everything that we've kind of said thus far, okay? Pay attention. When your mind dallies with a sensible object, when your mind repeatedly returns to a particular place, especially during a time of prayer, it means that you are in the grip of a passion. That is, a deep-seated impulse or powerful inclination. St. Maximus mentioned those passions that the people most commonly suffer from are desire, sorrow, anger, and resentment. So tomorrow, or at some other point when I have time and space, I'll read the final part of this reflection, which is, unless the mind despises an object, it cannot be freed from the passion. So tomorrow we'll discuss how to take those sorrow, or we'll take the passions that we mentioned, desire, sorrow, anger, and resentment, and we'll talk about how the confessor or how the elder both think that we can remove ourselves from that. Hope you have a good Monday, a good rest of your day, and I look forward to talking with you or you listening again. Thank you.